So we have another major development in two of the most critical two-way cases that we have right now sitting in front of the Supreme Court. And these deal with rifle bans, some bans that were put in place by some states, and then also magazine bans as well. You have both the Duncan magazine ban case out of California and then the Vermontes rifle ban case out of Illinois. They've been rescheduled for conference once again this Friday. And again, this is all happening at a very important moment where nationally we've had the Trump DOJ openly make statements that they believe the Supreme Court will in fact strike down rifle and magazine bans nationwide. So right now, two massive things are happening at the same time. You have the Supreme Court continuing to actively reconsider these cases, relist them, dealing with these nationwide issues on rifle bans and magazine bans. And then you have the federal government, the Trump DOJ, finally stepping in, taking a pro-choice stance, and also saying expressly that they believe the Supreme Court will eventually strike down these bans. So let's break down what is now happening. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, today we're going to be talking about the Duncan case and the Vermontes case because they are now moving once again for a new conference date this Friday. As you know, these cases have kind of been on that carousel of relist. The Supreme Court continues to punt on this issue. We have not gotten an answer. And the number of relists that are gathering in these cases now often, sometimes signals that they're just simply going to be denied. These are reaching high relist numbers where I don't believe there's really been many cases that have gotten this many relists and then been granted review by the Supreme Court, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. But on top of this, with these cases that are pending in these relists, and then also these statements from last term where you had Kavanaugh say that eventually soon, in a term or two, they will address the type of rifle bans and magazine bans. But with this high number of relists, you also now have the Trump DOJ stepping in, making statements that they believe that the Supreme Court will eventually strike down these rifle bans and magazine bans nationwide. And also the Trump DOJ is actively taking, steps on their own to challenge various state and city bans on rifles and magazines. Now, quickly, I want to set the stage for Duncan and Vermontes so you understand really what's at stake, especially with the California ban on magazines, because that is a restriction on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And the way that that operated in the lower court, where you had the Ninth Circuit sitting en banc upheld California's magazine ban that pushed this to the Supreme Court, but the lower court in the review by St. Benitez, he actually opened up Freedom Week. And so a lot of people in California now lawfully possess magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. But if the Supreme Court decides to punt on this case, not take review of this case, that means that the Ninth Circuit ruling will stand. And then a lot of people in California will be exposed to potential criminal, issues, or we will have to simply give up all of these magazines that we got from Freedom Week. That is the likely outcome if the Supreme Court does not step in on the Duncan case. Meanwhile, you also have the Vermontes case, which deals with the Illinois ban on so-called assault weapons, and that targets, AR-15 style rifles and those types of related firearms. And so altogether, these two cases represent two of the biggest, unresolved Second Amendment questions that are currently sitting in front of the Supreme Court. One dealing with standard capacity magazines, simply any magazine that holds more than 10 rounds, and then also a restriction on the possession and purchase of semi-automatic rifles, which again are very common arms. Now, recently in the Duncan case, it became even more important because the plaintiffs filed a supplemental briefing pointing to a ruling out of DC, and that was the Benson case and the ruling that came from the DC Court of Appeals. Now, as we've discussed previously, Benson had struck down a similar magazine ban and created what appeared to be a major split among the courts. The plaintiffs in the Duncan case argued that this was exactly why the Supreme Court needed to step in and review this California magazine ban. But then the DC Court of Appeals granted a rehearing en banc and vacated that original Benson ruling. California, in response to that, immediately notified the Supreme Court of that development and argued that the supposed split no longer exists because the Benson ruling has now been wiped out. So California's position essentially became there is no reason for the Supreme Court to intervene yet. Now, also on the Benson side, what we've seen recently develop is that that case is put on hold right now, and they're waiting for the Supreme Court to issue two major Supreme Court rulings in the Hamani case and then also in the Wolford concealed carry case. So the Benson case knows that the Supreme Court may reset some of this language around the Second Amendment. There may be some nuggets in there that can impact that magazine ban case. And so they're holding the Benson case until the Supreme Court issues those rulings, which should come really soon here by the end of this term. So late June, early July. But while this is all happening and while the Supreme Court continues to consider those two critical cases, the Trump DOJ has now launched their own aggressive push against rifle bans and magazine bans. Now, as we've discussed recently, the DOJ has now sued Denver over its AR-15 ban, and the administration has also now sued the state of Colorado directly over its ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. The DOJ is arguing that the AR-15 and standard capacity restrictions, are unconstitutional, that these items are protected under Heller and Bruen because they are commonly owned by tens of millions of law-abiding Americans for lawful purposes. And in fact, Harmy Dillon has now openly stated that the administration believes that the Supreme Court will eventually rule that AR-15s are protected nationwide. In fact, that was also posted by Trump himself, so he is also of the opinion, and he's in alignment with Harmy Dillon, that they believe the Supreme Court will eventually strike these down. Now, more importantly, in those statements, she said that the DOJ intends to help to make that happen. And they intend to make that happen either by publicly pushing for the Supreme Court to strike down these bans, or if they do not act on their own, the Supreme Court does not finally move on some of these cases pending in front of them, well, then the Trump DOJ is actively going to file their own lawsuits, proceed, with their own lawsuits against these various bans, and eventually force the Supreme Court's hand to have to address this issue. Now, legally speaking, the Denver and Colorado lawsuits are separate from Duncan and Vermontes, but strategically they matter enormously because now the federal government itself is actively pushing the same constitutional theories being argued in the Supreme Court petitions, and it sends a very clear signal to the Supreme Court that the Trump DOJ wants these bans to be struck down, and if they don't act on these cases right here and now, well, eventually they're just going to face a lawsuit from the Trump DOJ that makes it to them. The DOJ is essentially telling the courts that AR-15s are protected arms, that standard capacity magazines are protected arms, and that bans on those commonly owned firearms and magazines violates the Second Amendment. And that mirrors the exact core issues sitting in front of the Supreme Court right now in the Duncan and Vermontes case, along with some of the other cases that are also pending. And this creates a very different environment than we've seen, in the few months and really in just, all these years where you have these cases getting to the Supreme Court, dealing with pro-2A groups, private plaintiffs and advocacy groups pushing back against these state bans and city bans. But now the federal government itself is actively helping to push these issues towards Supreme Court review in a final decision. So now the Supreme Court faces an increasingly important question. Does the court continue allowing these lower courts to handle these issues differently across the country, or does it finally decide to step in and answer whether these bans on AR-15s and magazines can survive under Heller and Bruen? Because at this point, the pressure is continuing to build. So that's where things stand right now in these critical cases. Two of the primary ones, Duncan and Vermontes, we're going to be watching closely again after this conference date. And as we get more information, as it develops more and unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.